This comment says, any good tips for helping a dog that has a fidget response to stress? I've always thought my guy was over aroused, but now I'm thinking he's actually fidgeting. He's so overly food focused that he's wild. So let's start by talking a little bit about the difference between a fidget response and hyperarousal. So there's a bit of a Venn diagram happening here. You could have a hyper-aroused dog engaging in a fidget response, but you can also have a hyper-aroused dog who is not displaying a fidget response. And then let's talk about does the fidget response always have to be attached to hyperarousal? Let's talk about that more in depth in a minute. So hyperarousal, and we have a whole blog post about this on our website, but hyperarousal generally is used to refer to dogs who are chronically too high on the stress scale, but not necessarily due to anxiety. So their baseline is a yellow or higher, but they're not necessarily anxious. They're in just this chronic state of fight or flight. And it's exhausting. It's a form of chronic stress. It's a form of nervous system dysregulation. A fidget response happens when the dog is trying to cope with stress by fidgeting around. We can also see hyperactivity as a pain response, and that is often comorbid with some of these other states of being. So you could have a dog who is chronically hyperaroused, copes with stress through a fidget response, and perhaps is also hyperactive because of pain, as a way of coping with pain. And I'm bringing that pain piece, that hyperactivity or hyperexercise because of its high comorbidity. You could also have a dog who is hyper-aroused, but not necessarily displaying a fidget response, and not necessarily hyper activity focused. I do often see dogs who will cope with a stressful situation by hyper-focusing on their food, particularly if they have a bit of a training history. And perhaps the stronger that training history is, the more likely we might be to see this. So, for example, I have worked with dogs who do sports, and they come to me because suddenly they can't do their sports anymore. They're like running out of the ring to attack another dog, or a person, and these dogs have always had the stranger danger or the dog aggression or whatever the case may be, but they've been able to manage it below a behavioral threshold that was concerning to people in those predictable scenarios of the sports world. Or I have dogs who have a really strong history of training and of learning and engaging in that type of mental exercise. And so when something stressful happens, they pivot to that. They cope with that. They're often avoiding the trigger entirely and just focusing on the person or the treat pouch. And then we also have dogs who, when food comes out, that sends them up the stress scale. The food is the trigger. They are so aroused by the food that we have to address the food arousal first in order to get them into a thinking brain to use food effectively in those situations. For the dogs that kind of go into work mode, we are working to disassociate some of the cues that tell the dog that they're in work mode with our real life scenarios, and helping to try and translate some of these skills and to empower the dog to have other ways to cope that are more beneficial for them, so that they can self-regulate better and so that they're actually impacting their own stress levels on a physiological level. With the hyperactivity due to pain, obviously we're addressing the pain. And with our kiddos who respond in a fidget. So when we talk about fight, flight, fawn, fidget, freeze, we're generally talking about red zone occurrences. That's usually when we're using those terms. But if you're lower on the stress scale, let's say you're in a yellow and the dog is practicing avoidance as a way of coping down there in the yellow, that's also a type of flight, right? So generally when we talk about a fidget response, we are talking about it happening higher on the stress scale, like in an orange or a red. And so there is a level of elevated stress hormones. Hyperarousal isn't exactly the term we would use necessarily, but I also don't think it's necessarily a wrong term to use. But there may be other emotions under that, like anxiety, fear, frustration. So how do you help a dog in the fidget state? So it's important to recognize that when a dog is in fidget, fawn, or freeze, that they are still struggling. The behavior may or not be such that it is concerning on its face. So a dog in freeze might not be doing much of anything. A dog fawning might be really like asking for affection. They're making themselves small. A dog fidgeting might look like they want to play. But it's important to note that these dogs' stress levels are so elevated that fight's right there, right? Like we're already in the zone where fight occurs. And so this is where bites can happen, one place where bites can happen like seemingly out of nowhere. And so it's important to treat these other responses with the same seriousness that we treat fight, because the dog is in the same level of distress. And so if I have a dog fidgeting or fawning, I want to support them in taking space from the trigger and engaging in an activity that's actually going to help calm them, sniffing, licking, chewing. Food can be really helpful here if food is not increasing arousal on its own. If it is, we need to address that first before we can use food for calming, at least before we can use it really effectively. So the too long didn't read version of that is that you want to take space from the trigger and help them engage in an activity that's actually going to lower their heart rate, lower their stress hormones, rather than further increase them.